The story of Saudi Arabia oil, Vision 2030, NEOM, tourism, politics, and wealth. There are few countries in the world that have transformed as dramatically as Saudi Arabia. Just over a century ago, much of the Arabian Peninsula was defined by vast deserts, scattered tribal communities, and ancient trade routes that had connected civilizations for thousands of years. There were no gleaming skylines stretching toward the clouds, no trillion-dollar investment funds, no futuristic megaprojects rising from the sand, no Formula One races, international music festivals, or plans to host the world's biggest sporting events. For most of its history, Arabia wasn't known for wealth. It was known for survival. Life here was harsh. Summer temperatures regularly climbed above 50 degrees Celsius. Rainfall was scarce. Fresh water was one of the region's most precious resources. Outside a handful of oasis towns and coastal settlements, much of the landscape seemed almost impossible to inhabit. Yet for centuries, this unforgiving land occupied one of the world's most important geographical positions. It connected Asia, Africa, and Europe. It controlled ancient trade routes that carried spices, silk, incense, and precious metals across continents. And above all, it was home to Islam's two holiest cities. Every year, millions of Muslims traveled to Mecca and Medina, making the region not only spiritually significant, but politically influential long before modern nation-states even existed. But despite this religious importance, Arabia remained economically underdeveloped. While Europe industrialized, America expanded, and Asia modernized. Much of the Arabian Peninsula remained isolated. Few people imagined it would ever become one of the richest places on Earth. Then everything changed. In 1938, deep beneath the desert sands of eastern Saudi Arabia, engineers discovered something that would permanently alter the country's future: oil. Not just a little. Some of the largest petroleum reserves ever found. Almost overnight, Saudi Arabia found itself in possession of a resource the entire modern world desperately needed: cars, factories, power stations, airplanes, global trade. Entire economies would come to depend on the oil flowing from beneath Saudi soil. Within only a few decades, unimaginable wealth poured into the kingdom. Small desert towns became modern cities. Highways crossed landscapes once navigated only by camel caravans. Glass skyscrapers rose where sand dunes had stood for centuries. The country became one of the most influential members of OPEC and one of the most powerful players in the global energy market. For years, the formula seemed simple. The world needed oil. Saudi Arabia supplied it. Everyone benefited. Or so it seemed. Because beneath this extraordinary success lay an uncomfortable reality. What happens when the world begins moving beyond oil? That question has become one of the defining challenges of the 21st century. Climate change, renewable energy, electric vehicles, artificial intelligence, changing global politics. Each represents a future where petroleum may no longer dominate the global economy as it once did. Saudi Arabia understood this before many people realized how significant the transition could become. And rather than waiting for the future to arrive, the kingdom decided to build it itself. Today, Saudi Arabia is attempting one of the most ambitious economic transformations in modern history. It wants to diversify an economy that has depended on oil for generations. It wants to build entirely new industries. It wants to attract millions of international tourists. It wants to become a global technology hub. It is constructing futuristic cities in the middle of the desert, hosting Formula One races, welcoming some of the world's biggest sporting events, investing hundreds of billions of dollars across nearly every sector imaginable. Some people see these projects as visionary. Others call them unrealistic. Critics argue that many of the kingdom's ambitions face enormous financial, engineering, and political challenges. Supporters believe Saudi Arabia is preparing for a world that looks fundamentally different from the one that made it rich. Both sides agree on one thing: the scale is almost impossible to comprehend. At the center of this transformation stands one of the most influential and controversial leaders in the modern Middle East: Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. To supporters, he is the architect of a new Saudi Arabia. To critics, he represents the contradictions of a nation trying to modernize while maintaining absolute political control. His Vision 2030 program aims to reshape almost every aspect of Saudi society. Its success, or failure, will influence not only the future of the kingdom, but perhaps the balance of power across the entire Middle East. This is not simply the story of oil. It is not simply the story of wealth. It is the story of how a kingdom built on one of the world's oldest civilizations is attempting to reinvent itself for a future where the rules of global power are changing faster than ever before. Because Saudi Arabia is no longer asking how to profit from the world as it exists today. It is asking a much bigger question. Can an oil superpower reinvent itself before the world no longer needs its greatest resource? Chapter 1. Before the kingdom. Long before Saudi Arabia became synonymous with oil, it was known for something far more valuable. Location. For thousands of years, the Arabian Peninsula stood at the crossroads of three continents. To the west lay Africa. To the north, the great civilizations of Mesopotamia and the Mediterranean. To the east, Persia, and eventually India and China. Long before airplanes and container ships connected the world, merchants crossed these deserts carrying spices, silk, incense, gold, pearls, and precious stones. The journey was dangerous. Towering sand dunes stretched for hundreds of kilometers. Water was scarce. Temperatures regularly exceeded 50 degrees Celsius. Entire caravans could disappear into the desert, never to be seen again. Yet people kept coming, because Arabia was impossible to avoid. Its coastal ports connected maritime trade across the Red Sea and the Arabian Gulf, while its inland caravan routes became vital arteries linking east and west. Commerce flourished wherever travelers found water, and over time small settlements grew into thriving trading towns. But trade alone wasn't what gave Arabia its unique place in history. Religion did. In the 7th century, one event permanently changed the region, and eventually, the world. The birth of Islam. Beginning in the city of Mecca, the new faith spread across the Arabian Peninsula with astonishing speed before expanding into the Middle East, North Africa, Central Asia, and parts of Europe. Within only a few generations, Islamic civilization had become one of the world's leading centers of science, mathematics, medicine, architecture, philosophy, and trade. At the heart of this civilization stood two cities, Mecca and Medina. Every year, millions of Muslims made the pilgrimage known as the Hajj, creating one of history's oldest and largest recurring human gatherings. Pilgrims arrived from every corner of the Islamic world, bringing not only faith, but also ideas, cultures, languages, and commerce. Even centuries before oil, Arabia possessed extraordinary global influence. But politically, the peninsula remained fragmented. Unlike Europe, which gradually developed centralized kingdoms, Arabia was dominated by tribes and regional leaders. Loyalty was often directed first toward family and tribe rather than any unified national identity. Alliances shifted frequently, while local conflicts shaped daily life across much of the desert. For hundreds of years, large portions of the peninsula came under the influence of powerful empires. The Ottoman Empire in particular exercised varying degrees of control over Western Arabia from the 16th century onward. Yet even the Ottomans struggled to fully govern the vast interior deserts known as Najd. The terrain was simply too immense, the tribes too independent, and the distances too great. As a result, much of Central Arabia remained largely self-governed. It was here, in the heart of the desert, that a political and religious alliance would eventually emerge, one that would change the history of the peninsula forever. In the 18th century, Mohammed ibn Saud, a local ruler in Diriyah, formed an alliance with the religious scholar Muhammad ibn Abd al-Wahhab. One provided political leadership, the other provided religious legitimacy. Together, they laid the foundations for what historians now call the First Saudi State. Although that state would eventually be defeated by Ottoman forces in the early 19th century, the idea it represented never disappeared. Successive Saudi states rose and fell over the following decades, each attempting to reunify the Arabian Peninsula under the House of Saud. Their victories were often followed by defeats. Rival tribes challenged their authority. Regional powers intervened. Internal divisions repeatedly threatened to undo everything they had built. Yet one family remained remarkably persistent, the Al Saud dynasty. Then at the beginning of the 20th century, a young leader emerged who possessed both military skill and extraordinary political ambition. His name was Abdulaziz ibn Saud, known in the West simply as Ibn Saud. In 1902, accompanied by only a small group of loyal followers, he launched a daring raid to recapture Riyadh, the ancestral home of his family. The operation succeeded against overwhelming odds and became one of the defining moments in modern Saudi history. But reclaiming a single city was only the beginning. Over the next 3 decades, Ibn Saud gradually united vast regions of the Arabian Peninsula through a combination of diplomacy, tribal alliances, religious support, and military campaigns. One by one, rival territories came under his control. Then, in 1932, after decades of conflict and negotiation, he officially proclaimed the establishment of a new nation, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. For the first time, much of the Arabian Peninsula had been united under a single ruler. It was a remarkable political achievement. Yet economically, the new kingdom remained one of the poorest countries in the region. Its economy depended largely on pilgrimage, limited agriculture, livestock, and modest trade. Roads were few. Infrastructure was minimal. Education remained limited outside major towns. Much of the population still lived traditional lives shaped by the rhythms of the desert. No one could have imagined that beneath this seemingly barren landscape lay the resource that would transform not only Saudi Arabia, but the entire modern world. Within just 6 years of the kingdom's founding, a discovery deep beneath the sands of eastern Arabia would trigger one of the greatest economic revolutions in human history. It was a discovery that would turn a poor desert kingdom into an energy superpower. Chapter 2. The discovery that changed everything. When Ibn Saud founded the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia in 1932, he inherited a nation rich in history, but poor in almost everything else. There were few paved roads, very little modern infrastructure, limited healthcare, minimal industry. Outside the annual Hajj pilgrimage and small-scale trade, the kingdom had few reliable sources of income. Much of the population still relied on farming, fishing, livestock, and traditional commerce to survive. The government itself often struggled financially, with revenues fluctuating from year to year. The new kingdom desperately needed something that could transform its economy. No one knew that the answer was hidden thousands of feet beneath the desert. Ironically, the search for Saudi Arabia's greatest treasure began because another one had disappeared. For centuries, pearls from the Arabian Gulf had been among the region's most valuable exports. Entire coastal communities depended on pearl diving for their livelihoods. But during the 1920s, the invention of cultured pearls in Japan devastated the natural pearl market almost overnight. Prices collapsed, incomes disappeared, and many Gulf economies entered severe decline. Saudi Arabia needed a new source of wealth. Around the same time, American oil companies were becoming increasingly interested in the Middle East. Oil discoveries in Persia, modern-day Iran, and neighboring Bahrain suggested that vast petroleum reserves might exist beneath the Arabian Peninsula as well. Geologists believed eastern Saudi Arabia showed promising signs, but no one could be certain. In 1933, Ibn Saud signed a concession agreement with Standard Oil of California, granting the company exploration rights across large parts of eastern Arabia. It was a gamble. Drilling for oil was enormously expensive, especially in one of the harshest environments on Earth. Temperatures regularly exceeded 50 degrees Celsius. Sandstorms buried equipment. Fresh water had to be transported across vast distances. Every new well required enormous amounts of money with no guarantee of success. For years, the results were disappointing. Several exploratory wells produced little or nothing at all. Executives back in California began questioning whether the entire project should be abandoned. Costs continued rising while investors grew increasingly impatient. Then came well number 7. Known simply as Dammam number 7, drilling had already reached extraordinary depths without finding commercially viable oil. Engineers recommended stopping the operation altogether. Fortunately for Saudi Arabia, one man refused to give up. American geologist Max Steinicke insisted they drill deeper, much deeper. On March 3, 1938, his persistence paid off. Oil erupted from the well in quantities no one had imagined. It wasn't just another oil field. It was one of the most significant petroleum discoveries in modern history. Everything changed. Almost immediately, exploration accelerated across eastern Saudi Arabia. New fields were discovered one after another, revealing reserves that seemed almost limitless. What had appeared to be an ordinary stretch of desert was, in reality, sitting above one of the largest concentrations of oil ever found. The company responsible for developing these resources eventually became known as Aramco, the Arabian-American Oil Company. Over the following decades, it would grow into one of the most valuable energy companies in history. For Saudi Arabia, the effects were transformational. Oil revenues began flowing into government coffers, allowing the kingdom to invest in projects that had previously seemed impossible. Roads connected isolated towns, modern hospitals opened, schools expanded across the country, electricity reached communities that had never experienced it before. Ports were enlarged, airports constructed, and entire cities began growing around the new oil industry. The pace of change was astonishing. In less than a generation, Saudi Arabia moved from one of the poorest nations in the Middle East to one of its fastest developing economies. The world was changing too. Following the Second World War, demand for oil exploded. Europe needed to rebuild. America's automobile industry expanded rapidly. Commercial aviation entered a new era. Factories multiplied across developed economies, all powered by inexpensive petroleum. Oil wasn't simply another commodity. It became the fuel of modern civilization. And Saudi Arabia possessed more of it than almost anyone else. Recognizing the strategic importance of this relationship, another historic moment unfolded in February 1945. As the Second World War approached its conclusion, King Abdulaziz met U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt aboard the American cruiser USS Quincy in Egypt's Great Bitter Lake. The meeting lasted only a few hours, yet historians often describe it as one of the most consequential diplomatic encounters of the 20th century. Although no formal treaty was signed, the conversation laid the foundations for a strategic partnership that would shape global politics for decades. Saudi Arabia would become one of America's most important energy partners. The United States, in turn, would become one of Saudi Arabia's closest security allies. It was a relationship built on mutual interests. One possessed energy, the other possessed global military and economic power. Together, they would influence international politics throughout the Cold War and beyond. By the 1950s and 1960s, Saudi Arabia's oil production continued rising at an extraordinary pace. Pipelines stretched across deserts. Giant export terminals appeared along the Gulf Coast. Tankers carried Saudi crude to Europe, Asia, and North America, fueling industries that powered the global economy. Yet perhaps the most remarkable transformation wasn't happening underground. It was happening above it. A kingdom that had once struggled to fund basic infrastructure was beginning to accumulate wealth on a scale few nations had ever experienced. The desert had revealed its greatest secret, and in doing so, it had transformed Saudi Arabia from a forgotten kingdom into one of the most strategically important countries on earth. But the greatest display of Saudi Arabia's power was still to come, because within a few decades, the kingdom would discover that controlling oil didn't just create wealth, it could reshape the entire global economy. Chapter 3. How Oil Made Saudi Arabia one of the richest nations. Finding oil changed Saudi Arabia, but controlling it changed the world. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, the kingdom's oil production expanded at an extraordinary pace. New wells were drilled almost every month. Pipelines stretched hundreds of kilometers across the desert, connecting remote oil fields to export terminals along the Arabian Gulf. Tankers carrying millions of barrels of crude oil departed daily for Europe, North America, and Asia, supplying the fuel that powered the post-war economic boom. For the first time in its history, Saudi Arabia wasn't simply participating in the global economy. It was becoming one of the forces shaping it. As industrialization accelerated across the developed world, demand for energy exploded. Automobiles filled highways. Commercial aviation connected continents. Plastics, fertilizers, pharmaceuticals, and countless manufactured products all depended on petroleum. Oil had become the lifeblood of modern civilization, and Saudi Arabia possessed an extraordinary share of it. By the late 1960s, the kingdom had emerged as one of the world's leading oil producers, but another realization soon followed. Producing oil wasn't enough. Who controlled the price mattered just as much. For decades, major international oil companies, often referred to as the Seven Sisters, held enormous influence over global petroleum markets. Producing countries supplied the oil, but pricing and production decisions were often made elsewhere. That began to change in 1960. Saudi Arabia joined Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, and Venezuela in creating the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, better known as OPEC. The organization's objective was straightforward. Instead of allowing foreign companies to dictate prices, oil-producing nations would coordinate production and protect their economic interests. At first, many observers dismissed OPEC as little more than a symbolic organization. They wouldn't make that mistake again. Everything changed in 1973. Following the outbreak of the Yom Kippur War, several Arab oil-producing nations imposed an oil embargo on countries perceived as supporting Israel. At the same time, production levels were reduced dramatically. The consequences were immediate. Oil prices surged. Fuel shortages spread across Western nations. Long lines formed outside gas stations in the United States and Europe. Governments introduced fuel rationing, lowered highway speed limits, and encouraged citizens to conserve energy. Entire economies slowed as the cost of transportation and manufacturing skyrocketed. For the first time, the industrialized world fully understood something Saudi Arabia had already realized. Energy wasn't just an economic resource, it was geopolitical power. The kingdom had demonstrated that decisions made in Riyadh could influence inflation, stock markets, transportation systems, and government policies thousands of kilometers away. Saudi Arabia had become far more than an oil producer. It had become one of the world's most strategically important nations. The wealth generated during the following decades was almost unimaginable. Oil revenues poured into the kingdom at unprecedented levels. The Saudi government invested billions of dollars building modern highways, airports, universities, hospitals, desalination plants, and telecommunications networks. Entire cities expanded at breathtaking speed. Take Riyadh, for example. In the early 20th century, it was a relatively modest desert town surrounded by mud brick walls. Today, it is one of the Middle East's largest metropolitan areas, filled with towering skyscrapers, financial districts, luxury hotels, and infrastructure that rivals many of the world's leading capitals. The transformation happened within a single lifetime. Jeddah experienced a similar evolution. Once a historic Red Sea trading port serving pilgrims traveling to Mecca, it became a modern commercial center linking Saudi Arabia with global markets. New ports handled enormous volumes of cargo, while King Abdulaziz International Airport became one of the busiest gateways in the region. Across the kingdom, prosperity reached sectors that had once seemed impossible to develop. Education expanded rapidly. Healthcare improved dramatically. Life expectancy increased. Electricity became widespread. Modern water systems brought clean drinking water to communities that had depended on wells for generations. One of the country's most remarkable engineering achievements addressed perhaps its oldest challenge: water. Saudi Arabia possesses very few permanent rivers and receives limited annual rainfall. Yet its rapidly growing population required enormous quantities of fresh water. To solve this problem, the kingdom invested heavily in desalination technology, transforming seawater from the Arabian Gulf and Red Sea into drinking water. Today, Saudi Arabia operates some of the world's largest desalination facilities, allowing millions of people to live comfortably in one of the driest environments on Earth. But immense wealth also created new challenges. As oil revenues grew, the Saudi economy became increasingly dependent on a single resource. Government spending, employment, infrastructure, public services, economic growth, almost everything became linked, directly or indirectly, to oil prices. When prices were high, prosperity accelerated. When prices fell, the entire economy felt the impact. This dependence became particularly clear during the oil price collapses of the 1980s and later during periods of global financial instability. Saudi Arabia remained wealthy, but its leaders increasingly recognized an uncomfortable truth. The country's greatest strength could also become its greatest vulnerability. Then another development began changing the global energy landscape. New technologies, renewable energy, electric vehicles, climate policy. Countries around the world started asking how to reduce their dependence on fossil fuels. Investors began funding alternative energy sources. Automakers announced plans to phase out gasoline-powered vehicles. Governments introduced ambitious climate targets aimed at reducing carbon emissions. No one expected oil to disappear overnight. But Saudi Arabia understood that the world of 2050 might look very different from the world of 1970. The question was no longer whether the kingdom had enough oil. It clearly did. The question was whether oil alone could continue sustaining future generations. For decades, Saudi Arabia had mastered the business of exporting energy. Now it faced a far more difficult challenge. How do you reinvent one of the world's richest oil economies before the world no longer depends on oil in the same way? Chapter 4. The House of Saud and Absolute Power. By the beginning of the 21st century, Saudi Arabia had become one of the richest nations on earth. Its oil reserves fueled the global economy. Its influence inside OPEC gave it enormous power over energy markets. Its sovereign wealth stretched across continents. But unlike many of the world's major economies, Saudi Arabia's political system had changed very little. It remained an absolute monarchy. To understand modern Saudi Arabia, you first have to understand the House of Saud. Unlike constitutional monarchies such as the United Kingdom or Sweden, where kings largely perform ceremonial duties, Saudi Arabia's royal family sits at the center of government itself. The king is both head of state and head of government. He appoints ministers, approves national policy, oversees the armed forces, and ultimately holds the highest executive authority in the kingdom. This system has existed since King Abdulaziz unified Saudi Arabia in 1932. After his death in 1953, power passed not to elected politicians, but from one son to another. King Saud, Faisal, Khalid, Fahd, Abdullah, and Salman each inherited leadership during periods of enormous regional and global change. Each ruler left a different mark on the kingdom. King Faisal is widely remembered for modernizing education and government institutions while strengthening Saudi Arabia's position in international diplomacy. His leadership during the 1973 oil crisis dramatically increased the kingdom's global influence. King Fahd oversaw a period of rapid economic expansion during the oil boom while investing heavily in roads, universities, airports, and healthcare. Under his rule, Saudi Arabia also became a central player during the 1991 Gulf War, allowing coalition forces to operate from Saudi territory after Iraq invaded Kuwait. King Abdullah later introduced cautious economic and educational reforms, expanding scholarship programs that sent hundreds of thousands of Saudi students to universities abroad. He also invested heavily in infrastructure and encouraged greater participation of women in certain areas of public life. Yet despite these changes, one principle remained constant. Political power stayed within the royal family. Supporters argue this continuity has provided Saudi Arabia with remarkable stability in one of the world's most volatile regions. While neighboring countries experienced revolutions, civil wars, military coups, and political collapse, Saudi Arabia largely avoided the instability that swept across much of the Middle East during the Arab Spring. Critics see the system differently. Human rights organizations have long argued that political freedoms remain limited. Political parties are not permitted in the way they exist in many democracies. Public criticism of the government can carry serious consequences, and activists have raised concerns over freedom of expression, judicial independence, and the treatment of dissidents. These debates have followed Saudi Arabia for decades, and they continue today. Religion also plays a unique role in Saudi governance. Since the kingdom's founding, the alliance between the House of Saud and the country's religious establishment has shaped many aspects of public life. Islamic law forms the foundation of the legal system, influencing legislation, education, family law, and social norms. For much of the 20th century, Saudi society was among the most socially conservative in the world. Gender segregation was common in many public spaces. Movie theaters remained closed for decades. Concerts were rare. Tourism was largely limited to religious pilgrims visiting Mecca and Medina. Alcohol was prohibited. Entertainment options remained limited compared with many neighboring countries. These policies reflected a vision of society that emphasized religious tradition and social stability. For decades, relatively few people expected that to change. Then came 2015. King Salman ascended to the throne following the death of King Abdullah. Soon afterward, his son, Mohammed bin Salman, rapidly emerged as the kingdom's most influential figure. Known internationally simply as MBS, the young crown prince represented a new generation of Saudi leadership. Unlike many of his predecessors, he spoke openly about technology, artificial intelligence, tourism, renewable energy, entrepreneurship, and reducing the kingdom's dependence on oil. He argued that Saudi Arabia faced a defining moment. The oil wealth that had transformed the country during the 20th century might not guarantee prosperity in the 21st. The kingdom needed a new economic model, a new identity, and perhaps even a new image. His vision was ambitious beyond almost anything attempted in modern economic history. Build entirely new industries, create millions of private sector jobs, transform Saudi Arabia into a global tourism destination, construct futuristic cities in the desert, invest hundreds of billions of dollars in technology, entertainment, sports, logistics, and renewable energy. Some hailed the plan as visionary. Others questioned whether it was realistic, but almost everyone agreed on one thing. Saudi Arabia was preparing for the most dramatic transformation since the discovery of oil. Whether the kingdom could successfully reinvent itself would depend largely on one man and the strategy he called Vision 2030. Chapter 5. The Prince Who Wants to Change Everything. For nearly 80 years, Saudi Arabia followed a formula that seemed almost impossible to break. The kingdom produced oil. The world bought it. The economy grew. But by the middle of the 2010s, Saudi leaders could see a problem on the horizon. The world was changing. Millions of young Saudis would soon enter the workforce, expecting careers, opportunities, and lifestyles that simply couldn't be supported by an economy dependent almost entirely on oil. The kingdom needed more than another oil boom. It needed a new economic model. That responsibility fell to one man, Mohammed bin Salman. Known globally by his initials, MBS, he became crown prince in 2017 after rapidly rising through Saudi Arabia's leadership. Unlike previous generations of Saudi rulers, Mohammed bin Salman openly spoke the language of startups, technology, investment, tourism, and innovation. He believed Saudi Arabia had spent too long relying on a resource it couldn't control forever. Oil had made the kingdom rich, but it wouldn't necessarily keep it rich. His solution became known as Vision 2030. Announced in 2016, it was one of the most ambitious national transformation plans ever attempted. Its goal wasn't simply to grow the economy, it was to reinvent it. The strategy rested on three major pillars. The first was diversification. For decades, oil accounted for the majority of Saudi government revenue and export earnings. Vision 2030 sought to reduce that dependence by expanding industries. The second pillar focused on investment. Saudi Arabia already possessed enormous financial resources, but instead of simply storing wealth generated from oil exports, the kingdom wanted to invest it across the globe. At the center of that strategy stood the Public Investment Fund, commonly known as the PIF. Today, it has become one of the largest sovereign wealth funds in the world. The fund has acquired stakes in international businesses while simultaneously financing some of the largest construction projects in human history. The idea was straightforward. Use today's oil wealth to build tomorrow's economy. The third pillar focused on society itself. For decades, Saudi Arabia had been known as one of the world's most socially conservative countries. Under Vision 2030, that began to change rapidly. Billions of dollars flowed into new sectors as Saudi Arabia attempted to position itself for a future beyond petroleum. Supporters described Vision 2030 as one of the boldest economic strategies of the 21st century. They argued that Saudi Arabia was finally preparing for a world where oil might no longer dominate global markets. Some argued that parts of the economy still depended heavily on oil revenues. Others questioned whether private investment could eventually replace government spending on the enormous scale required. There were also concerns about execution. Building an entirely new economy isn't like constructing a single skyscraper. It requires education, entrepreneurship, and perhaps most difficult of all, time. History offers very few examples of countries successfully reinventing themselves at this scale, especially within a single generation. Yet Mohammed bin Salman remained confident. He repeatedly argued that Saudi Arabia could no longer afford incremental change. The world was moving too quickly. If the kingdom wanted to remain one of the world's most influential nations, it had to think bigger than anyone else. Much bigger. Because Vision 2030 wasn't just about economic reforms, it was about building projects so ambitious that they would redefine what was considered possible. Projects unlike anything the modern world had ever seen. Chapter 6. Building the Impossible. If Vision 2030 is the blueprint for Saudi Arabia's future, then NEOM is its boldest promise. Announced in 2017 by Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, NEOM isn't simply another real estate project or a new city on the map. It is an attempt to rethink what a city could be in the 21st century. Located in the northwestern corner of Saudi Arabia, along the Red Sea, and close to the borders of Jordan and Egypt, NEOM covers an area of roughly 26,500 square kilometers, an expanse larger than some entire countries. It sits at the crossroads of Europe, Asia, and Africa, placing nearly 40% of the world's population within a 4-hour flight. Location, once again, became strategy. Saudi Arabia wasn't trying to build another Dubai. It wanted to build something the world had never seen before. The most famous part of NEOM is undoubtedly the line. When it was first unveiled, the concept stunned the world. Instead of expanding outward like every major city in history, the line would stretch in a perfectly straight path for approximately 170 kilometers across the desert. Two mirrored skyscrapers, rising hundreds of meters into the sky, would stand parallel to one another, creating a narrow urban corridor unlike anything ever attempted. The idea was simple. Design a city around people, not automobiles. Architects described it as a revolution in urban planning. Critics were far less convinced. Many questioned the engineering feasibility of constructing two continuous mirrored structures across such a vast distance. Others argued that costs could climb into the hundreds of billions of dollars, making it one of the most expensive infrastructure projects ever conceived. There were also environmental concerns, debates surrounding local communities, and questions about whether millions of people would actually want to live in such a radically different urban environment. Saudi officials acknowledged that projects of this scale would take decades to complete. But the line was only one piece of a much larger vision. Another district, Oxagon, aims to become one of the world's largest floating industrial and logistics hubs. Powered increasingly by renewable energy and advanced automation, Oxagon is intended to attract high-tech manufacturing, robotics, biotechnology, and clean industries that could diversify Saudi Arabia's economy beyond petroleum. Further inland lies Trojena, perhaps the most surprising project of all. A mountain destination designed for year-round tourism, luxury hospitality, outdoor adventure, and, most remarkably, winter sports. The idea of skiing in Saudi Arabia initially sounded absurd. After all, this is one of the hottest countries on Earth. Yet Trojena takes advantage of the kingdom's higher altitude mountain regions, where cooler temperatures make seasonal winter activities possible with carefully managed technology and infrastructure. If completed as envisioned, it would become one of the world's most unusual mountain resorts. Today, Saudi Arabia wants visitors to come for beaches, history, adventure, culture, luxury, and business. Collectively, these projects represent investments worth hundreds of billions of dollars. The scale is almost impossible to comprehend. Entire cities, entire industries, entire lifestyles, being built simultaneously. Supporters describe them as the foundation of a post-oil economy. Critics argue that some ambitions may be revised, delayed, or scaled to reflect economic realities, pointing out that projects of this magnitude inevitably evolve over time. History suggests that almost every megaproject changes during construction. Saudi Arabia's are no exception. Yet regardless of how individual developments ultimately evolve, one thing has already become clear. The kingdom is no longer thinking in terms of decades. It is thinking in terms of generations. And these projects are about far more than architecture. They are about changing how the world sees Saudi Arabia, because attracting investors is one challenge. Changing global perception is another entirely. To accomplish that, Saudi Arabia turned to something with even greater international reach than oil: sport, entertainment, and global culture. Chapter 7. Sports, Tourism, and Soft Power. For most of the 20th century, Saudi Arabia's influence came from one thing: oil. If countries wanted energy, they looked toward Riyadh. But influence in the 21st century looks very different. Today, countries compete not only through military strength or economic output, but through culture, entertainment, technology, tourism, and global perception. Political scientists call this soft power. Instead of forcing others to pay attention, you make them want to. And over the last decade, Saudi Arabia has invested billions of dollars in building exactly that. One of the first industries to change was tourism. For decades, Saudi Arabia was one of the least visited major countries on earth by international leisure travelers. Millions of Muslims traveled there every year for the Hajj and Umrah pilgrimages, making religious tourism one of the largest annual gatherings in human history. But outside those religious journeys, relatively few international tourists considered Saudi Arabia a holiday destination. There was a simple reason. It wasn't designed to be one. Tourist visas were extremely limited. Entertainment options were few. The country focused primarily on religion, government, and energy rather than international tourism. Vision 2030 sought to change that. In 2019, Saudi Arabia introduced a new tourist visa program, opening the kingdom to visitors from dozens of countries. It was a historic shift. Almost overnight, a country that had remained largely closed to international leisure tourism began welcoming travelers eager to experience something entirely different. The government quickly invested in restoring UNESCO World Heritage sites such as Alula, where ancient Nabatean tombs carved into sandstone cliffs offer a glimpse into civilizations that flourished thousands of years before the discovery of oil. Luxury hotels appeared among the desert landscapes. Concerts were organized beneath towering rock formations. International visitors discovered that Saudi Arabia's history stretched far beyond petroleum. Then there was the Red Sea. With more than 1,700 kilometers of coastline, crystal-clear waters, untouched coral reefs, and hundreds of islands, Saudi Arabia possesses one of the world's least explored coastal regions. For decades, much of it remained inaccessible. Now it is being transformed into a luxury tourism destination aimed at competing with places like the Maldives, Seychelles, and the Mediterranean. Eco-resorts, private islands, luxury marinas, marine conservation projects. The message was clear. Saudi Arabia wanted to become known not only for what lay beneath the desert, but also for what existed above it. Entertainment followed. Only a decade ago, public concerts by international artists were almost unimaginable inside the kingdom. Today, global musicians, comedians, film festivals, and cultural events attract millions of visitors every year. Entire entertainment districts have emerged in Riyadh and Jeddah, reflecting a society changing at remarkable speed. Yet perhaps no industry illustrates Saudi Arabia's new strategy better than sport. The kingdom didn't simply begin hosting sporting events. It began buying influence within global sport itself. Formula One arrived in Jeddah. Boxing's biggest heavyweight fights moved to Riyadh. The world's best golfers joined the Saudi-backed LIV Golf League. The calendar grew larger every year. Then came football. Saudi clubs stunned the sporting world by signing some of the biggest names in global soccer. Cristiano Ronaldo's arrival at Al Nassr in late 2022 transformed perceptions almost overnight. Many initially dismissed it as a publicity stunt. Instead, it became the beginning of a much larger movement. Suddenly, one of the world's fastest-growing football leagues was located in Saudi Arabia. The strategy extended beyond players. Through the Public Investment Fund, Saudi Arabia acquired majority ownership of Newcastle United Football Club in England's Premier League, while simultaneously investing in stadiums, youth development, broadcasting, and sports infrastructure at home. Critics described these efforts as sports washing. The idea that hosting prestigious sporting events and investing in global sports could improve a country's international image while drawing attention away from political controversies. Saudi officials reject that characterization. They argue that sport is simply another pillar of economic diversification, capable of generating tourism, investment, employment, and international partnerships. Every great transformation attracts admiration and criticism. Saudi Arabia is no exception. For every investor who sees opportunity, there is another observer who sees risk. For every architect who marvels at NEOM, there is an economist asking whether projects of such extraordinary scale can deliver the returns required to justify their cost. Yet despite these extraordinary ambitions, Saudi Arabia's transformation continues to generate difficult questions. Can a country modernize economically while maintaining its existing political system? Can enormous investment projects deliver long-term prosperity? And can the kingdom reshape its global image while continuing to face criticism over human rights? Those questions remain at the center of one of the most closely watched transformations of the 21st century. Critics ask whether every megaproject can realistically achieve its original goals. Some developments have already been adjusted as planning evolved. Construction timelines have changed. Budgets have been refined. Priorities have shifted. Saudi officials describe these changes as normal for projects of unprecedented scale. Independent analysts generally agree that large infrastructure programs almost always evolve during implementation. Another challenge lies in employment. One of Vision 2030's central objectives is creating millions of private sector jobs for young Saudis. Historically, many citizens preferred careers in government because they offered stable salaries, generous benefits, and long-term security. The kingdom now wants more people working in entrepreneurship, technology, finance, logistics, and manufacturing. Changing an economy is difficult. Changing expectations can be even harder. Then there is oil itself. For decades, Saudi Arabia has spoken openly about reducing dependence on petroleum. Yet oil revenues continue to finance much of the country's transformation. In many ways, this creates a fascinating paradox. Saudi Arabia is using oil to prepare for a world beyond oil. The success of that strategy depends on timing. If diversification succeeds before global oil demand declines significantly, the kingdom could emerge stronger than ever. If diversification falls behind while energy markets change more rapidly than expected, the transition becomes considerably more challenging. Foreign policy presents another layer of complexity. Saudi Arabia occupies one of the world's most strategically sensitive regions. It borders the Red Sea and the Arabian Gulf. It shares interests with both Western powers and emerging Asian economies. It maintains partnerships with the United States while simultaneously expanding economic ties with China, India, and other rapidly growing nations. Rather than relying on a single international relationship, Saudi Arabia increasingly seeks to position itself as a global connector between East and West. Supporters view this as pragmatic diplomacy. Critics argue that balancing competing global interests will become increasingly difficult as geopolitical tensions continue to evolve. Despite these debates, something remarkable has already happened. The conversation about Saudi Arabia has fundamentally changed. Only a generation ago, most discussions began and ended with oil. Today, people talk about tourism, artificial intelligence, luxury hospitality, sports, renewable energy, technology, investment, urban planning. Whether one views these developments with optimism or skepticism, they have already achieved one important objective: They have changed how the world thinks about Saudi Arabia. The kingdom is no longer defined solely by what lies beneath its desert. It is increasingly being judged by what it builds above it. The final question, however, remains the biggest of all. Can Saudi Arabia truly complete the transformation it has begun? Or will Vision 2030 become another ambitious plan that proved easier to announce than to achieve? The answer will determine not only the future of the kingdom, but perhaps the future balance of economic power across the Middle East itself. Chapter 8. Can Saudi Arabia build the future? Every generation witnesses a handful of countries attempting something so ambitious that the rest of the world can't help but watch. In the 19th century, it was the industrialization of the United States. After the Second World War, it was the economic miracles of Germany and Japan. Later came South Korea, Singapore, and China, countries that transformed themselves within a single generation through long-term planning, investment, and economic reform. Today, Saudi Arabia is trying to write its own chapter in that story. The question is no longer whether the kingdom has the financial resources. It does. The real question is whether money alone can create the future. History suggests that it cannot. Money can build airports, it can build skyscrapers, it can build roads, ports, stadiums, and even entirely new cities. But creating an innovative economy requires something much harder. Talent, education, entrepreneurship, research, competition, ideas. These cannot simply be purchased overnight. They have to be cultivated over decades. Saudi Arabia understands this. That is why Vision 2030 extends far beyond construction projects. Universities are expanding partnerships with some of the world's leading academic institutions. Technology startups are receiving government support. Artificial intelligence has become a national priority. Global technology companies are opening regional headquarters in Riyadh. The kingdom is investing heavily in data centers, cloud computing, robotics, biotechnology, and renewable energy. The objective isn't just to participate in tomorrow's economy, it is to help shape it. Perhaps no institution better represents this ambition than the Public Investment Fund. Unlike traditional sovereign wealth funds that focus primarily on preserving national wealth, the PIF has become an active investor in industries expected to define the coming decades. Artificial intelligence, electric mobility, tourism, gaming, semiconductors, healthcare, green hydrogen, advanced manufacturing. The strategy is remarkably straightforward. If oil created the wealth of the 20th century, technology may create the wealth of the 21st. Saudi Arabia wants to own part of both. The kingdom is also positioning itself geographically. Its location has always been one of its greatest advantages. Nearly one-third of global maritime trade passes through nearby waterways. Major shipping routes connect Europe, Asia, and Africa within easy reach of Saudi ports. Modern logistics hubs, airports, industrial zones, and railway projects are designed to transform that geography into long-term economic strength. In many ways, Saudi Arabia hopes to become not only an energy hub, but a global business hub. Yet enormous challenges remain. The first is execution. Announcing megaprojects is relatively easy. Completing them on time, within budget, and at the promised scale is something else entirely. Throughout history, even the world's richest countries have struggled with projects of extraordinary complexity. Saudi Arabia's developments are among the largest ever attempted. Delays should not be surprising. The second challenge is attracting people. A futuristic city isn't successful because of its architecture. It succeeds because talented people choose to live there. Scientists, engineers, entrepreneurs, artists, investors, researchers, families. Creating an environment that attracts global talent requires more than iconic buildings. It requires opportunity, quality of life, world-class education, healthcare, culture, and confidence that people can build their futures there. The third challenge is perhaps the most unpredictable: the global economy itself. No country controls interest rates. commodity prices, geopolitical tensions, technological disruption, or unexpected global crises. Saudi Arabia's transformation is taking place during one of the fastest periods of change in modern history. Artificial intelligence is reshaping entire industries. Climate policy continues evolving. Energy markets remain volatile. Global supply chains are being reorganized. Every one of these developments could influence the kingdom's long-term plans. Yet despite these uncertainties,